In this example, I want to go ahead and take a look at how we can use IAM policies to access resources within a service that's within AWS. And specifically, what I want to do is I want to restrict access within an AWS S3 bucket. So the idea with the built-in policies that are built in as part of AWS is that those policies would give you access to kind of an all or nothing approach. So I could grant full access to S3 or I could grant read-only access to S3, but there is no in between. And what I want to do is I want to imagine a scenario where I'm in S3, I have an S3 bucket named Brian's Company, and within that bucket I am going to have certain folders that I want certain employees to have access to and certain folders that I don't want employees to have access to. So I want kind of that really granular approach of employees should access only what they need access to. Okay, so the way I want to set this up initially is within my bucket, I'm going to go ahead and create a couple folders. So I'm going to create a development folder. And the idea there is that that'd be a folder for software developers. So I'll go ahead and create that folder. I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called financials. And the idea there would be that accountants or marketers or something like that might access the financials. I'm going to create another folder called private with the idea that maybe certain executives could access that private folder. And that's kind of the setup for this demo is I want to provide access to developers that would allow them to access the development folder, but not the financials folder and not the private folder. Okay, so I want to limit access depending on your job role. So to kind of further this example, I might consider this a unique experiment in that I'm imagining a scenario where I'm setting up a company and my first employees are all consultants, so I don't have full-time employees, and the idea would be that I want all of my consultants to be able to access my company bucket so they can access and see the company bucket so they could see that there's a development folder, a financials folder, a private folder, but then from there they'd only have access to the folder based on their job role. So if I hire software consultants, they'd have access to the development folder. If I hire an accountant as a consultant, they'd have access to the financials, and kind of that'll be the scope of this demo. Okay, to further illustrate this demo, what I want to do is I'm going to jump over to Atom, and I want to create some just basic text files so I can put them into the root of those directories. So I'm going to have one file called dev.txt, and I'll just save that to my desktop. And the idea is that I'd be able to upload that, and then I'll have another which will be finance.txt. And we'll just put finance in here. And then I'll have another, which will be my private folder, which I'll save as private.txt. And then one last one, which will be home, and I'll save that as home.txt. Okay, and I want to upload those folders at their respective subdirectories. So home, I'm going to go ahead and upload right here at the root of the bucket. And then in the financials, I'll upload a file. So I'll add the finance file. And then in the development, I'll upload the dev file. And then in the private, I will upload the private file. And this is just so we can see if our access is working once we actually make the corresponding changes. So right now, I'm logged in as an administrative user, and I'm able to do whatever I want in all of these buckets. So within Brian's company, I was able to create folders, I was able to upload files. I can go into the dev folder, I can rename files, so I can come through and I could say I want to rename this file to whatever I want to rename it to. There's no issues there because I'm an administrative user. What I want to do now is I want to jump over to IAM, and I want to start creating users that do not have the same permissions, that have those more granular permissions to allow access to the resources that they should have access to. Okay, so I'm going to go over to my services, and I'm looking for IAM. I'm just going to open that in a new tab. So I have IAM in one tab and my S3 bucket in another. Okay, and under users, what I want to do is I want to create a new user. So I want to add a user. So the username is going to be Sue. Sue does not need programmatic access, so we're not using the AWS SDK at this point, so that would be programmatic access. Instead, we want Sue to have access to this web-based AWS console that we're currently working on. I'm going to have a custom password, so I'm just using a password that I can remember, and I'm not going to force the user to change their password at the next sign-in. And I'm not going to grant any permissions, I'm just creating the user. So we have one user who's Sue, and then I'll do the same thing with Tom. So I want to add another user, Tom. And again, Tom needs access to the console. I'm actually making Tom have the same password so I can remember it. And I'm just going through the process of creating that second user. And Tom should be all set now. Okay, so I have Sue and Tom, and both of them are set up so that they have no permissions within the AWS ecosystem. Okay, and in order to see that, what we do is we can open up an incognito window. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to Chrome, and I want a new incognito window. It's here. I want a new incognito window. I'm going to go to the AWS console. And if I go to the AWS console, this generally is fine, but I'm going to select an IAM user, and then I need the account ID. I just want to walk through this because I'm not sure I mentioned it in a previous video, but if I go back over to Chrome and I'm looking at IAM, I have two user accounts. So the sign-in for those IAM user accounts is right here where it embeds the account number in the sign-in URL. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that to my clipboard, and then I can bring that over to my incognito window. And then instead of trying to worry about what the console URL is, I'm just going to paste that sign-in URL into the browser, and you'll notice it automatically brings in the account ID. Okay, so I could have punched in the account ID if I knew the account ID, so I don't need that whole URL, but I do need the account ID in order to sign in with these IAM users. So I'm going to sign in with Sue. And the reason I'm doing this in the incognito window is because if I did this in the non-incognito window, so if I was over here and I did that same thing, what would end up happening is as soon as I sign in with that IAM user account, the administrative user account would get signed out. So I can only be signed in to one user account at a time. So by using an incognito window, I'm able to have both user accounts signed in at the same time. So that's the idea there. If I skip over to the incognito window, what I want to see is S3. So I'm logged in with Sue. I want to go to S3. And what you're going to see is that Sue doesn't have permission to see anything. So you'll notice that she doesn't have permission to list any of the buckets. And what I would see is that Sue doesn't have access to any AWS service. So if I go to any of these AWS services, I'd end up with the same exact results. But for this example, we just kind of want to focus on S3 and granting permission to the S3 resources that Sue should have access to. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over to the administrative account because I want to grant Sue the permissions that she needs. So I'm just going to skip back over to the administrative account, and I could go into the user and I could add permissions to the user, but really what I want to do is I want to set up a group that has permissions to do what we need to do, and then that group will have permissions to manage S3. So I'm going to create a group called consultants, and I'm going to go ahead and add Sue and Tom to that. And then the permissions that I could attach to this group by default are all those built-in AWS policies that kind of take that all or nothing approach. So none of these are actually going to work for me. So I'm just going to go ahead and create the group, and that group right now does not have any permissions. So you'll notice that the permissions are not defined. I want to add some permissions to it. So I'm going into consultants, I'm going to permissions, and if I search the permissions, so I'm just searching for S3, I have to add permissions. And if I try to attach policies and I search for S3, you'll notice that really some of these are tied to other services other than S3, but the S3 specific services is I can either grant full access or read-only access. And for our demo, that doesn't really match our needs or meet our needs. So I don't want to use the built-in permissions, so I'm going to cancel out of this. And when I add permissions, instead of attaching a built-in policy, what I want to do is I'm going to create an inline policy for the consultants group. Okay, and the way this is going to work is I'm going to choose a service. So the service is the AWS service that I want to work with. So in this case, it's S3. So that's fairly straightforward. And then the action that I want to allow, so you'll see they kind of group these. So under listing and reading and tagging and writing, there's all sorts of different permissions that I can apply. So all of these individual permissions are appropriate choices. But the one that we want to start with is right now Sue can't see anything in S3. So if I go back over to Sue, we go to the S3, the root of S3, we can't even see the buckets. Can't see anything. So you'll notice that it's saying that in order for Sue to see something, we really should enable this S3 list all my buckets action. So that's what we want to add, is that S3 list all my buckets action. So under list, there's a list all my buckets. So that's the action that we're choosing. And then the resources that we want, okay, so our action's fine. I don't know why our resources are grayed out. That's interesting. I want to cancel out of that. I should be able to select the resources. So if I go back to create an inline policy, I think it was just because I had rolled up so many things and their service is not necessarily working all that well. So S3, and I want to list all of my buckets. And then I'm just going to go ahead and review that policy. And it's asking me to name the policy. Allow users S3 list buckets. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and create that policy. So all consultants should be able to go into S3 and list the buckets. And the reason I wasn't seeing that resource is because we're not getting granular about what specific bucket and what specific resource within a bucket at that point. List all my buckets is really the root of S3. So it was my mistake to think that there should be a resource. But now, because I've added this permission, I should see an effect now for Sue. So Sue's a member of the consultants group, and the consultants group has the permission to allow users to list all the buckets in S3. So if I skip back over and I reload the page, what I should see at this point is Sue should now be able to see all of my buckets. Okay, so she can see my company bucket, and if she tries to click on that bucket, you'll notice that I'm getting another insufficient permissions to list objects, and it says, hey, you should allow that user to list the bucket. Okay, so at this point, I want consultants to be able to actually get into that company bucket, and I want them to be able to see that there's a private folder, a financials folder, a development folder. So I want consultants to be able to see all that information. So I want to add that list bucket action. So I'm going to jump back over to IAM. Under permissions, I'm going to add another inline policy. Again, I'm choosing S3. The actions that I want are to list the bucket. And now you'll notice that I can choose a resource, and I want to add an ARN. So it's going to ask, what's my bucket name? So I want to say it's ARN : AWS : S3 : and then my bucket. And what I really want them to be able to do is I want them to be able to list anything. That's not what I wanted, sorry. I think that might be all I actually need. And if we go ahead and review that policy, what'll happen is I want to name that. So I want to allow users root level listing of Brian's company. Okay, so I'm just naming that policy. Okay, and now what I expect is if I jump back over to the incognito window, that Sue should be able to then have access to that bucket. So I want her to be able to see the objects that are inside of this bucket. Okay, and you'll notice that now she has the permission to see all the buckets, and then she has a secondary permission because of the new inline policy that we just set up to see the root of that folder. Okay, and now I want to take this a step further, and I'm going to say that Sue is a software developer. Okay, so she's a consultant that's going to help this new company with the software side of things. So what I want to do is I want to make her have access to this development folder. Okay, so that's the idea, is that the development folder would be accessible to her, but the rest of these folders and files would not be accessible to her. Okay, the other thing that I have going on is if I try to access this home.txt file, I'm able to do that, but I don't have permission to view the bucket versioning status, and you'll notice that there's a get bucket versioning permission. So different permissions are going to show up depending on what you're trying to do, but for now I just want to focus on the fact that Sue does not have access to go into this development folder. She shouldn't have access to go into that development folder. Right now, she does have access to go into the development folder, and the reason why, I'm glad I tested this, the reason why she has access to that development folder is the permission that we just added, which was allow users root level listing of Brian's company. So if I go into that permission, what I'm going to see is that I've set it up so that I have the list bucket permission for that entire bucket. So I can see everything across all the folders. What I want to do is I want to add a specific condition to say that I only really want you to see the things at the root level of that bucket. I don't want you to be able to dig into the development folder or the financials folder or the private folder. But right now, you saw me access the development folder, but I have access to everything. And the reason why I have access to everything is because I wasn't restrictive enough in my permissions because I didn't set these request conditions. Okay, and these request conditions are a little bit tough, but I can add some conditions. And what I want to do is, if I actually, I think it'll make more sense if we actually look at the URL. So from Sue's perspective, so if I go back over to the incognito window, what you'll notice is that there's this prefix, okay, and What the prefix is it's what the prefix is it's basically going to say, am I actually looking at a folder or a file? Okay, and then I also have delimiters. So a delimiter might be a /. Okay, and where I will point you is I'm actually working through the AWS S3 walkthrough. So there's a walkthrough that's going to walk you through exactly this example. So I'm just going through this walkthrough. And one of the things that you'll notice is, and I got to find exactly where it is in here, that when I make a request, you get a prefix and a delimiter. Okay, and what ends up happening is the resources within AWS, they actually don't have folders. AWS represents them as common prefixes. So the folders are actually prefixes. And then the delimiter is typically just a /. So what ends up happening is when you return these files, I don't know if they have a good example of that. Yeah, they do. I don't know that they actually do. But I have to add in to my request that I want the prefix to be just an empty string because I don't want them to access the folders, and I want the delimiter to be a /. Okay, so I will link to this in the comment section. So I will go ahead and go into IAM. I want to add a condition, and what I want to do is I want to say the condition is the S3 prefix, or the delimiter, I guess it doesn't matter, is equal to a /. And then I want to add another condition where the prefix is equal to an empty string. So the S3 prefix is equal to an empty string. Okay, and it's going to make me fill in a value here. I'm not sure that this is going to be the right value, so I just did double quote with no space in between, so I'll go ahead and add that. And I'm going to go ahead and review the policy. And you'll notice that I'm getting this unexpected error, and I think it's because of the double quote and double quote. If I go over to the JSON, what you'll see is that I have the delimiter, but I don't have the prefix. So what I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and type the S3 prefix being an empty string. Okay, and now in the visual editor it'll show, but it'll also have the correct JSON. So for some reason the AWS tools don't handle an empty string, so now I'm going to go ahead and review the policy and save those changes. Okay, and the idea here is that I should not have restricted Sue from seeing the root of my company folder. So if I reload this, so she should still see the root level listing. Okay, so that looks good. But she shouldn't be able to get into any of these other documents. So she shouldn't be able to get into the development folder. She shouldn't be able to get into the financials folder. And she shouldn't be able to get into the private folder. And the reason we're seeing that is because if I allow the root level listing, by putting those conditions on this policy, what I'm saying is that the delimiter is a / and the prefix is equal to an empty string, meaning I'm only talking about the root directory. So I'm limiting access to just the root directory, and thus the name, allow users root level listing of Brian's company. Okay. So that's the idea. Okay, so now, as I was kind of alluding to, Sue is going to be a developer for this company. So what I want to do is I want to go over to the user groups. And the reason I'm setting it up this way, theoretically, I could just keep adding permissions to the consultants. But the idea is that this company is going to have different types of consultants, right? So I might have a software developer who's a consultant. I might have an accountant who comes onto the company as a consultant. I might have a marketing person that comes onto the company as a consultant. All of those folks are going to need access to the bucket and the root level listing. So the permissions for all of my consultants are the same, Where we're going to differ with permissions is based on your job role. So a software developer will have additional access beyond the fact that they're a consultant. They're going to have access to that dev folder. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create another group, and I'm going to call the group Software Developer, and I'm going to add Sue and Tom. And again, none of the built-in policies are going to make sense or work for me, so you'll notice that I have this group. Sue and Tom are in there, but they don't have any permissions, so I want to go through and create some permissions. And what I want to do is, under permissions, I'm going to create another inline policy. And again, the service that I'm looking for is S3. The actions, so basically what I want the user to be able to do is I want them to be able to upload files, I want them to be able to delete files, I want them to be able to rename files, I want them to be able to, so I basically want full access to that dev folder. Okay, so not everything, but a quite extensive list. So I want to be able to read, and specifically I want to be able to get an object. I'm going to need the permission get object ACL if I'm going to allow the user to rename objects. So get object ACL, and then get object version and get object version ACL. Okay, so those are the 4 read permissions that I'm going to need. And then I'm going to want to write, so I want them to be able to delete objects, and I'm going to want them to be able to put objects. So 4 reads, 2 writes, and then the resource that I'm looking for is a specific ARN, so I have to add the bucket name, so Brian's Company. Okay, and then the object name that I'm looking for is dev. So you'll notice Brian's Company / dev. And then I think I want any here. Nope. Let's try that. I actually think I want to edit that, but it's easier for me to edit it through JSON. So I think if I go into JSON, what I really want is Brian's Company / dev / star, meaning any of the resources in that dev folder. And then I'm going to go ahead and review that policy and create the policy. And it's not letting me create the policy because I didn't name it, so I have to give it a decent name. So allow developers read, write, delete, access to development folder. Okay, so quite an extensive name, but I'm going to create that policy. And the idea here is that now, because Sue and Tom are both a member of consultants, so they continue with those permissions, but now they're also a member of this software developer group, so we should have some additional permissions assigned to Sue and Tom. So if I jump over to my incognito window, the idea would be that Sue should now have access to this development folder. Okay, and it doesn't look like Sue has access to the development folder, so something must be wrong. So I'm just going to go ahead and expand this, and I use dev instead of development. So what I want to do is I actually want to go in and edit that because the folder name is development. Okay, and then I'll review the policy and save the changes, and hopefully that's the only mistake I made, but I'm not positive at this point. So Sue, I'm just going to back out one directory, should have access to the development folder, and she does not. So let's try this a different way. So Sue does not have access to this development folder, and I think I have to do this with conditions as opposed to resources. So right now the resource is Brian's Company. I'm going to go ahead and edit that, and I really want it to just be a specific bucket and not an object. And it's not allowing me to do that. I wonder if I have to actually change the actions a little bit. What I want to do is I want the users to have access to the development folder, but I think I have to change it a little bit. So I want a list bucket on the development folder, and then I want to do all of these other actions on the development folder as well. So bear with me for 1 second. I think if I cancel out of this, I think what I really need to do is this read permission is to the folder. I actually don't think I want the read folder. I think I want the list bucket permission. So I'm going to go ahead and add an inline policy specifically to the folder so that they can list the bucket. Okay, so under list, I'm going to choose list bucket. And the resource that I want is my bucket, so Brian's company. And then I'm going to supply a condition so that I can list the bucket and specifically the folder. So I'm going to go ahead and add a condition here. And the condition that I want is the S3 prefix. And the S3 prefix is really representing my folder. So what I want to do is the operator is I'm going to say that the folder is for the development folder. Okay, so I'm saying that the string is equal to the development folder. Now, this ends up being a little bit of a problem. So the prefix is going to be equal to the development folder. But what I really want is I want anything under the development folder. So the prefix ends up being that additional stuff with the delimiter. So what I really want to do is I want to say where the string is like development, and then I want to add this wildcard character. Okay, and then if I go into JSON, I think that's what I actually want. So I should be able to review the policy and create the policy. And this is allow users to read Brian's company development folder. So this is a read-only permission, and then the rest of the permissions where they're actually doing the work would be in this other permission that I had already set up, but really we're not talking about the read here, so that's a separate policy. So two separate policies, one to get the read, where I can specify just the development folder, and then the second policy that we created was for all of those different actions, to upload files, to delete files, to rename files. Okay, so if I've done this correctly, now I should be able to jump over to the incognito window. I should be able to reload this development folder, and hopefully Sue now has access to the development folder. Noticing is that you'll notice the prefix is development, and we have this lowercase d here for development. And if I go back over to my bucket, the development folder I named with the lowercase d, and I'm confident that in my policies I'm using an uppercase D. So if I come back over to my policy and I go to read my development folder, and if I go to the JSON, I have this uppercase D. What I want to do is I want to match that. So it is case sensitive. So let's review the policy, save the changes, and I'm crossing my fingers at this point that Sue, because she's a developer, should now have access to the development folder. So if I go into the development folder, you'll notice that Sue does have access to the development folder. Let's say I tried to create a folder, test1, and I create the folder. That's verifying that that put object permission works. If I come back through to this file, I go into actions and I want to rename that object. So instead of having all these A's, I come through and now I just change it back to dev.txt. That looks to be fine. If I try to delete the folder, Tells me I don't have access to the bucket versioning, but it looks like it's still allowing me to delete that object. Okay, so it was successful. I should be able to close out of here. So you're seeing that I can delete the folder. And then it looks like I'm able to do the things that I need to do in the development folder, but then I want to make sure that I'm not able to do things that I shouldn't be able to do. So if I go into the private folder, you'll notice that Sue does not have access to the private folder or the financials folder. Okay, so this is kind of the setup that we're going to use for policies in order to granularly manage our S3 bucket. At the end of the day, the administrative account or the root user account is the one that's paying for all of the AWS resources. So I really don't want resources created that shouldn't be created. If I'm in charge of the bill, I don't really want my consultants coming in, creating new S3 buckets and doing things that they shouldn't be doing. I want them to have restricted access, but I also want them to have the access necessary to do their job. Okay, and we're doing that through inline policies. So if I skip back over to the policies that we created, under user groups for consultants, we granted Sue and Tom access to list all of the buckets, and then we allowed them to list the contents of the root directory. Okay, that's what allows them to see the files and folders that are in the bucket. Okay, so the first is I want to allow you to list all of the buckets. So that's the first permission that we added, so they can see all the buckets. But then once they have that, then within the bucket we want them to be able to actually see the objects that are in there. And that's the list bucket permission. Okay, so that was the first group, which was consultants. In the second group, software developer, under permissions, we allowed them to read the company folder. So we said, yep, you can list the bucket contents for that development folder. So that was fine. But then in order for them to actually be able to do the things that they need to do, we added a second policy, which was saying for that development folder underneath there, you can do pretty much whatever you need to do. So you can create new objects, you can get an object, you can delete objects, you can do all of those things. So we did that with 4 policies. The reason I broke this up between consultants and software developers is it might be necessary that I have a new consultant that comes through. I create a new group called accountants. I don't have any users for that yet, but I'm going to create an accountants group. And the idea with the accountants group is that if I create a new user account, I can make them an access to the consultants group. So I go through, I add a new user, Jim. Whoops. I want to add a user named Jim that has kind of similar setup to Sue and Tom. So Jim has no permissions at this point, but I can say, oh, Jim's going to come onto the company as a consultant, so I should be able to take Jim and add him to a group. So I can add him to the consultants group right now. So Jim is a member of consultants. He can see some resources in S3. I would just now need to add a policy that allows him to see the financials folder. Okay, so I don't have to go through all the work. I don't have to repeat the process of allowing access to see all the buckets and to allow that root level listing. All I have to do is kind of create a new role, much like our software developer role, that grants access to that specific folder. So if I was doing that, I'd go into user groups and I'd probably want to model it after what a software developer looks like, except instead of going into that development folder, I'd want to go into the financials folder. Okay, and that's the idea with these inline permissions, is it allows me to get granular within an AWS service, which allows users to kind of meet their job roles. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of these AWS policies. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here for